Part 1. Afternoon of a Final. Brussels, the 29th of May, 1985. The late afternoon sun poured down on the ancient streets, reflecting off the yellow bricks and dark roofs of the Belgian capital. Heysel Stadium, built in 1930, once the pride of the city, was now just an old structure with a tired beauty of time. The mottled walls, cracked concrete steps, and rusted iron fences still tried to brace themselves for another event, despite having long since ceased to meet modern football safety standards. Outside the stadium, the stream of people poured in like an endless river. The pubs around Heysel opened early in the morning, and by afternoon, they were full. Clusters of Liverpool fans with red scarves around their necks sang familiar songs. Juventus fans in black and white striped shirts, waving Italian flags, responded with equally strong chants. Red, white, and blue flares were lit before the sun set. Beers were opened continuously. Laughter and whistles rippled through the air, a mixture of excitement and something vague and inexplicable. The atmosphere of a European final was reaching its peak, but beneath the bright surface lay an unease that no one was willing to look directly at. Heysel had never really been ready for a game this big. The crowd control system was lax. The entrances were too narrow. The high, jagged fences had been erected years ago but had never been properly reinforced. They stood motionless in the afternoon sun, looking like the weary witnesses of a dozen football seasons past, and with enough pressure, they could collapse like cardboard. Inside the stadium, the Z stand, what the organizers called the neutral area, wasn't neutral at all. It was old, with weak walls, poor fire escapes, and most importantly, it was arranged so that Juventus fans were right next to Section X, where Liverpool fans stood. Only a cheap fence and a net separated two masses of people, carrying with them excitement, pride, beer, and the lingering violent memories of European hooliganism. That misalignment, which seemed like a mere logistical detail, was actually a tinderbox placed right in the middle of the stadium. No one knew that having two rival fan bases standing so close together, in the most run-down part of Heysel, was a ticking time bomb. But on that afternoon, as music blared from the speakers, as flags fluttered in the wind, and tens of thousands of footsteps marched into the stands, no one thought of disaster. Everyone believed that this would be a true night of football, a final that would unite the two sides of Europe. But amidst the smiles, the singing, and the cheering, there was one thing that no one knew. In just 1 hour, those sounds would be replaced by the final screams of many people. And in just 2 hours, European football would have to face a wound so deep that it would not heal nearly 4 decades later. Part 2. Stupid Air. Everyone believed that this would be a true night of football, a final that would unite the two sides of Europe. The concrete floor was cracked like old wounds. The walls were patchy, pieces of plaster about to fall off. The metal fences were so rusty that a single hard hit would break their hinges. But the organizers still believed that a little temporary repair would be enough, a vague and reckless belief, built more on subjectivity than responsibility. The police were deployed, but they were understaffed and under-strategic. What's more, they were not trained to control two sets of passionate, historically conflicted fans like Liverpool and Juventus. Some officers just stood by the wall, watching the crowd as if they were witnessing an event they had no right to intervene in. A few others tried to divert traffic, but the shouting, the flares, and the pressure of thousands made all their efforts futile. On the Liverpool side, many fans, most of whom had drunk a lot of beer since lunch, began chanting and pounding their fists on the fence as part of a pre-match ritual. The metallic clang echoed throughout Area X, creating a sharp, restless sound. Several groups in red shirts approached the fence, jumping up the uneven steps, making the fence vibrate like a stretched string. Meanwhile, on the Juventus side, the atmosphere was completely different. The Italian fans were crammed into the narrow Z section, squeezed into an area that was neither large nor safe enough. Many of them did not understand why they were being placed right next to Liverpool's section when they did not have tickets for the neutral section. They shouted for security to do something, to open an exit to another section, but the only response they received was silence or blank shrugs. A feeling of unease spread like a thin layer of fog. The crowd began to jostle slightly as some tried to get away from the ringing barrier on Liverpool's side. The concrete floor beneath their feet shook with each step not from an earthquake, but from thousands of footsteps pounding down at once. From the corners of the pitch, people began to hear curses, the sound of objects being thrown, the short clanging of metal. A few bottles flew over the fence, shattering into sharp pieces on the ground. The flares flickered in the afternoon light, glowing red like the first signs of a growing tragedy. But no one expected that those small vibrations, the screeching of metal, the pressure of the crowd pushing forward, and the nascent chaos would soon turn the wall at the end of Section Z into a blade of death. In a few minutes, Heysel would no longer be a football stadium, but the stage of a disaster that no one could stop. Part 3. A Wave of Panic. Around 19. The late afternoon light flooded into Section Z, but instead of creating a festive atmosphere, it illuminated faces tense with chaos. A group of Liverpool fans suddenly rushed towards the dividing fence. No one knew what had triggered them, the beer, the challenge, or simply the rush of the last few minutes. But they rushed forward, shouting, banging on the metal, and then, in unison, they pushed forward towards Zone Z like a red wave over the edge of a cliff. For Juventus, the scene was interpreted in the worst possible way. The Italians in Zone Z, already pressed against the wall, were startled, thinking they were about to be attacked for real. They screamed, panicked, and tried to back away from the impact. Within seconds, indietro, indietro, back off, resounded throughout the stands, but the sound only spread the panic faster. Then the domino effect began. Hundreds of people fell upon hundreds in front of them. Those in the front rows were pressed against the wall, their hands trying to hold on to anything. Railings, lampposts, stairs, but all were slippery under the weight of hundreds of bodies behind them. The crowd, trapped in a small space, suddenly turned into a flood of water rushing in one direction. The old concrete wall that had been there since 1930, with its zigzag cracks that foreshadowed something wrong. A few police officers tried to squeeze into the space between the two groups of fans. They held out their hands, shouting for calm, but their voices were immediately swallowed by the screams and the occasional clanging of metal. With just a slight push, they were sucked back, swept away by the stream of people squeezed between two invisible walls, the iron wall on Liverpool's side and the concrete wall behind Juventus. The atmosphere in Zone Z changed abruptly. It was no longer the sound of victory cries or cheers. Instead, it was a stifling mix of cries for help, broken screams, the sound of fists hitting concrete, and the sickening sound of bones being crushed against metal. Those in the front row tried to turn their heads to the side to breathe, but there was no space for even a breath of air. They felt their lungs being squeezed, their chests unable to expand. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" a Liverpool fan shouted, a genuine panic sound, but no one could hear, and no one could stop. As the crowd moved by inertia, each person was no longer an individual, but just part of a huge mass being pushed towards the rotting wall, as if being sucked into a chasm. In seconds, the disjointed movements turned into a full-blown panic. The whole of Section Z swayed. Some people slipped, pulling others down on top of them. Crying, sobbing, calling each other's names echoed intermittently like the broken sounds of a nightmare. Everything was falling back towards a single point, the point from which anyone standing there knew they might never get out again. Part 4. The Wall Comes Down, 1901. In the chaos of thousands of people jostling, Another sound rang out small but sharp as a knife cutting through the air. Crack. A dry sound echoed from the back of the Z stands. For a few seconds, no one could tell what it was. A broken bottle, a bent iron bar, or something much worse. But only those in the front row, those pressed against the wall, could clearly feel the ground beneath their feet vibrate like the gasp of something about to break. Then came a second sound, louder, heavier. Crack, crack. A fissure as thin as a thread appeared in the concrete, then stretched out like a stone snake wriggling in the fading light. A few fans turned, their eyes wide, and in that moment, the terror was prophetic. There was nothing between them and death. They opened their mouths to scream, but their screams were swallowed by the screaming crowd behind them. Then the wall collapsed. Not a huge explosion like in the movies, but a short, heavy boom, like a small mountain giving way. A large chunk of concrete broke off, crashing down on the people who had been pressed against it. Dozens of bodies were crushed instantly, trapped under tons of debris. Those standing near the wall felt the world before them suddenly turn to dust and stone. Legs were sucked into the rubble, arms flailing in the air, trying to break free from the unbearable weight. In the instant the wall collapsed, the entire Z stand seemed to be torn in two. Some people were thrown hard onto the cement floor, falling on top of each other in layers. The crowd behind, still being pushed forward by the hundreds of people, continued to slide forward and trample the bodies that had not yet moved. No one was intentionally trampling, they just had no choice. As the mass of people was sucked into the collapsed space, each individual lost control of their legs. Then the wall collapsed. Then came a second sound, louder, heavier. Crack, crack. A fissure as thin as a thread appeared in the concrete, then stretched out like a stone snake wriggling in the fading light. A few fans turned, their eyes wide, and in that moment, the terror was prophetic. There was nothing between them and death. They opened their mouths to scream, but their screams were swallowed by the screaming crowd behind them. In the aisles, the scene was even more brutal. Many were pressed so tightly that their chests could not rise to breathe. They tried to open their mouths to take a breath of air, but all they got was dust and heat from hundreds of bodies pressing down on them. Some died standing, pinned between the wall and the crowd behind them, their eyes still open, not yet understanding how they had left this world. Screams rang out sharply, as if someone was tearing the air with their hands. Concrete dust rose up in a thick gray mist, covering a large area of the stand in a thick gray mist. Hands reached out from the rubble, trembling. The cries of, "Ayudo! Ayudo! Save me!" rose weakly, then gradually faded into metallic clangs and sobs. Part 5. When football stops. Football, what should have been a celebration, had turned into hell. And the most horrifying thing was that it all happened before the match had even started. Not a single player stepped onto the field. Not a single whistle was blown. But in the stands, dozens of people were dead, hundreds were injured, and thousands more were panicking, not understanding what had just happened. When the dust began to dissipate with the afternoon wind, the truth appeared like a scene from a battlefield, not a football field. Dozens of people lying motionless, their bodies twisted in positions that could not be those of living people. Shoes were scattered everywhere, blood-stained scarves, faces covered in white dust, eyes wide with fear. The police rushed in, but the force was too small compared to the sea of panic. A few officers only had time to raise their hands to signal, "Back off," but no one actually did. People continued to stream in from the side streets, not understanding what was happening, adding to the chaos. Some Liverpool fans who had been labeled aggressive were the first to climb over the fence, leaving their hostility behind, to try to pull victims trapped under the rubble. They lifted chunks of concrete with their bare hands, turned over bricks, pulled bodies out of the darkness. One shouted, "Here! There's someone under this block!" and bent down, trying to grab a small hand that was poking out from the crack. Paramedics were present, but they were stuck because the entrance to the stands was blocked by the rushing crowd. Several ambulances were blocked outside because the police couldn't clear the way in time. The suffocating victims, who would have survived if they had been pulled out in 10 to 20 seconds, died right in front of hundreds of people, simply because no one could reach them in time. The cries of "Aiuto! Aiuto!" gradually disappeared, replaced by the sound of ragged breathing, and then stopped altogether. In the dressing room below, the players of both teams were preparing to step onto the field when they heard the first news from the security staff. They thought it was just a minor collision, but the whispers in the corridor became clearer. There are people injured, a lot. When Platini, Juventus's brightest star, asked, "Are there people dead?" no one dared to answer. Only the ambulance sirens echoed from the stands, each long and choking sound in the air. A few Liverpool players stood by the wall, their faces pale. Sporadic cries rang out in the dressing room, as if both teams understood. Tonight's match no longer had the meaning of football. But UEFA made a cold decision. The match had to go on. If the match was cancelled, they feared the crowd outside would panic even more, possibly leading to riots across the city. That decision later became one of the biggest stains in the history of European football. On the field, 22 players ran in a daze, their legs heavy as lead. Outside, the cheers were replaced by screams, sobs, and cries as people searched for their loved ones in the chaos. As the sky darkened, the ambulance lights shone on white tarps that had been hastily pulled out. One row, then two. Bodies were laid side by side on the grass, right next to where the trophy ceremony had been held just hours earlier. The wind blew a corner of the tarp away, revealing a small child's hand, forcing a paramedic to quickly kneel down and cover it. Outside, ambulance sirens blared throughout the night, like a funeral march that never ended. Football had stopped, but tragedy had not. Part 6. The Legacy of the Wall. As the Heysel night drew to a close, the stadium was slowly engulfed in a dark, ashen haze. On the grass where the coronation ceremony should have taken place, 39 bodies lay silently under white tarps. Hundreds more were taken to hospitals with shock, broken bones, internal injuries, or psychological trauma that would last a lifetime. Outside, the world watched the images from Zone Z, where the wall collapsed, leaving a bare, jagged expanse of concrete and shoes. It was no longer a football pitch. It was the remains of a bloody night. The investigation began the next morning, and the conclusion was more brutal than any blow. Heysel was no accident. It was the result of years of mistakes that had been ignored. The stands were in serious disrepair, but were still being used as good until refurbishment. The wall at the end of Zone Z had actually been cracked. Multiple maintenance workers had reported, but no one had fixed it because of the high costs and tight schedule. The organizers had placed fans of both teams right next to each other in an area that was too small, too weak, and completely unsuitable for a crowd of thousands. Police were understaffed, mismanaged, and slow to react before the panic set in. Many officers were assigned without a plan for dealing with violence. Emergency exits were too narrow, leaving crowds unable to retreat when pressed. Basic security procedures controlling entrances, separating fans, checking for flares were either non-existent or half-hearted. When the investigation report was released, Europe was in shock. UEFA announced one of the most draconian decisions in its history, banning all English clubs from European competition for 5 years, with Liverpool banned for 6. Heysel became a byword for shame, a stigma that European football was forced to confront whenever it recalled the era of pitch violence and lack of accountability. But behind the administrative decisions were real-life pain. Many families still keep their final tickets now yellowed, the edges curling as a last memento of their loved ones. Some keep their scarves, jerseys, or their sons' caps in glass cases. afraid to open them because the sight of them brings back the pain. For them, Heysel is not a historical event. It is the day they lost their loved ones in a stadium that should have been safe. Years later, outside the rebuilt stadium, a stone memorial was erected with 39 names etched into it. People bring flowers, light candles, and stand in silence in front of the wall each year at the end of May. But those who survived or witnessed it carry a memory deeper and more painful than any plaque. The moment they saw the joy of football turn into a night of mourning in a matter of minutes. One witness once said, "Football didn't kill them. The rotten stadium killed them." And that is the real legacy of Hazel Night, not just the reports, the sentences, or the speeches. It is a reminder that when indifference, complacency, and greed overshadow responsibility, the price is always human life. A lesson that Europe must learn to ensure that such a bloody night never happens again.